Well, hi, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Gerson, Program Director for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association, and welcome to an NGA webinar on chronic absenteeism, which continues to be a bipartisan challenge across the country. Today, I'm honored to be joined by three experts in this area. First, Hedy Chang is the founder and executive director of Attendance Works, a national and state-level initiative aimed at advancing student success by addressing chronic absenteeism. Second, Denise Forte is president and CEO of the Education Trust. Prior to Ed Trust, Denise held leadership roles at the Century Foundation and Leadership for Educational Equity. She also served as a senior congressional staffer for more than 20 years and at the U.S. Department of Education during the Obama administration. And third, Dr. Nat Malkus is a senior fellow and the deputy director of education policy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in empirical research on K-12 schooling. Prior to joining AEI, Dr. Malkus was a senior researcher at the American Institutes of Research and a former middle school teacher in Prince George's County, Maryland. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Malkus, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the data you've collected on chronic absenteeism through your Return to Learn tracker? What does your analysis show? What trends are you seeing? And where are you seeing particularly high chronic absenteeism rates now?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Here at AEI, I founded the Return to Learn tracker just to track school district responses over the course of the pandemic, and much of that has been focused on chronic absenteeism over the past year. And I'll just share the site here so you can see what we're looking at. Here's the site, and we collected data on district level data on chronic absenteeism, really wanting to look at this over time. So this is from state departments of education. You can see in 2017, sort of an incomplete picture. When you get to 2018 and 2019, this is where chronic absenteeism was pre-pandemic, about 15% of students. That was no small thing. That was about 1 in 6 K-12 students missing 10% of the school year. The next 2 years here, 2020 and 21, during the pandemic, the data is a little doubtful. And then in 2022, you can really see how dramatic the change was. This is about 90% of an increase in chronic absenteeism from pre-pandemic trends. We see it across the board. We see it in every state. And in 2023, so we don't have data for this year because it's not quite wrapped up, but we have data for most states in 2023, and that data is has come down mercifully, but it hasn't come down enough. And like you said in the intro, this is the real problem. There's more data on the website, and I'll just show briefly. This is chronic absenteeism pre to post pandemic 2022, and you can see this in a number of cases, but relatively disadvantaged, lower achieving districts had higher chronic absenteeism before the pandemic. They also had higher increases. But at the same time, the trend that you see in this graph is that chronic absenteeism across the board increased proportionately the same amount. And so it's important to realize that while there are certain kinds of districts that do struggle with chronic absenteeism and did before the pandemic, the increase that we've seen is really across the board. And that problem is really why we're focused now on getting the word out about the priority of this. It's across the board, and it's a problem that we really need to make a high priority.
Well, thanks, Dr. Malkus, and I really appreciate you starting from the aspect of where were we pre-pandemic, that this was already very much a challenge pre-pandemic, but the much more amplified, and as you said, across the country, seeing these challenges in all states. Hedy, I want to move to you and talk a little bit about Attendance Works' recent efforts in this area. I know you've been a long time working on this issue. Are you seeing similar trends to the data that Nat shared? And what are you seeing as sort of some of the primary shifts and barriers as Dr. Malkus was talking about sort of that change from pre to post pandemic, and also between different ages, different grades of what those barriers have been.
Yeah, I think our trend analysis is pretty in parallel to that. The one difference would be that Attendance Works tends to use the federal data, which one means that it's not quite actually as updated as NATS are, because the federal data is a year or two delayed before it actually is produced. But in general, you're seeing the same doubling. I will call attention to a couple of trends. One that we always saw before the pandemic and continues, you see chronic absence is higher in the early grades, it gets a little better, and then it starts to escalate up in high school. We sometimes call it the Nike swoosh, which is challenging, but it's important to notice that you have these grade level transitions, and the transition grades, particularly, like kindergarten, ninth grade, are especially affected. And what happens in middle school depends a little bit on the structure of middle school. The other piece we're seeing that I would just add is we were looking at how many schools experience what you might say is high or extreme levels of chronic absence. How many have 20% or even 30% or more of their kids chronically absent? Because arguably, once you have chronic absenteeism levels that high in a school, the impact of it isn't just affecting the kids who are chronically absent, it's making it harder for teachers to teach, set classroom norms, kids to learn. There's some evidence, particularly through Jacob Kirksky's recent research that builds on Michael Godfrey's research, which is that it makes it more likely that if you have a large number of students who are chronically absent, that their peers in the classroom are going to miss school the following days. So we have to pay attention to some of the group peer effects of chronic absence. And because the levels have been such an extraordinary increase, that peer effect, which used to only affect, so 20% or more chronic absence levels only affected about a quarter of all schools before the pandemic. Post-pandemic, about 2/3 of all schools. And that has huge implications for both how we have to think about a much broader effort to address it, as well as makes it even more urgent that we address this issue. But you also asked me, what are we seeing as some of the shifts and the barriers and the challenges? And let me pull up a slide deck here real quick. So even before the pandemic, we saw the reasons for absence sort of falling into these buckets: barriers, aversion, disengagement, and misconceptions. And those are good ways of sort of understanding the challenges that keep kids from showing up to school. And they can vary by time, place, and grade, but usually they fit somewhere in these buckets. But what we saw in the pandemic is a real increase in certain kinds of challenges: family responsibility, sibling care, high school students needing to support themselves and their families, especially as families were hit hard, especially in low-income communities, by the health and economic impacts of the pandemic, trauma and mental health. Kids lost family members, and those kinds of issues really escalated. We also saw a continuation, and in some places, you really are still struggling with chronic acute illness, poor transportation, housing and food insecurity. These are kinds of issues that we saw increase. But I also saw on the barrier issue, these are part of the explanation of why what Nat said earlier, you have higher levels in higher poverty communities, and then even maybe, and their doubling meant even huge proportions of their kids being chronically absent. But then we see these things that are also affecting kids now: social anxiety, peer challenges, struggling academically or behaviorally. This disrupted routine of school really hasn't had an impact. The closures of schools, and then kids not feeling connected back in, so that unwelcoming school climate, or the feeling that school's unpredictable, are bigger issues where this aversion might be affecting actually more kids in terms of their showing up to school. And then disengagement. kids not feeling engaged, connected. They lost out in that disrupted 2 years of their relationships, both to adults and peers. And I think we are all still not quite back there in terms of connecting to each other in person. And folks may not, especially when we had sort of this promise that we can just, you can just go online and you can learn. And folks not seeing the connection between showing up to school in person and important outcomes. And some, I think, mistaken beliefs that you can make up for it through online learning when some of what school offers can't be made up online. And then the last thing, and that's partly this misconception here, but I would also add the issue of, we close schools down saying that we've got a pandemic and you should stay home for any sign of illness. When now the COVID pandemic is in a very different situation. You don't need to stay home. The health guidance has changed. It's also true that there are this was a challenge before the pandemic, but even maybe more of a mystery now. There are a lot of times kids have health-related symptoms, stomach aches, headaches, sniffles that aren't contagious symptoms. They're an allergy, they're anxiety. They're not things that kids should stay home from school, but because we had this emphasis on staying home for school for any reason, it's been hard to move people away from that misperception. So these are all some of the reasons that we're seeing this doubling that Nat explained. And in low-income communities, you're seeing incredibly high rates that are fueled not only by these issues of aversion, disengagement, and misconception, but huge barriers to getting to school that remain in those communities. And our key to understanding how to address it is going to build upon, or need to build upon, a deeper understanding of what's happening and what are these barriers. And the one last thing I would add is I think we need to understand what's happening for our youngest learners and what's happening then, like for our high school kids, where you see those spikes, because the young learners, a lot of that has to do with family engagement and how we're supporting families. With high school kids, it's a lot about whether kids see school as a place where they're going to get to a better future, and how we support those two groups of kids might look very different.
Thanks, Hedy. Lots of great information there, and I really appreciate you walking through understanding the challenge itself and that could be multifaceted. So not just the barriers, but also aversion, disengagement, you said, misconceptions, and thinking through so that when you're working to address it and what may be different in different communities, or as you said, different ages, different grades may need different solutions and interventions to help out on that. And then the peer efforts that you lifted up as well, that this isn't just about the student that's missing school, but that ripple effect it's having on other students and educators in the building. Denise, want to move to you and talk a little bit about Ed Trust efforts in this area. I know you have affiliates across the country. What are you hearing from them in this area?
First off, I just think the data from Attendance Works and AEI is so important. So really grateful to be on a panel with them to hear their good work and how important this is for us to be really focusing on this. Like, school attendance is an important predictor of student outcomes. And so, the research shows that chronically absent students are less likely to read on grade level by third grade, more likely to score lower on standardized tests, and get suspended in grade school. As Hedy pointed out, when you look at grade spans, more likely to drop out of high school, less likely to continue to post-secondary education, and social engagement starting as early as kindergarten. So this is a subject that we need to focus on. We need to focus on deliberately and with a lot of intention. 8 million students were chronically absent before the pandemic closed schools, and the pandemic's led to alarming increases. In the 20 to 21 school year, at least 10 million students missed 10% or more of school days. That's just crazy. And these high level of chronic absence have exacerbated educational and societal inequities that existed long before COVID-19. And we do know that students from low income backgrounds, students of color, students whose families speak language other than English, those with disabilities, are more likely to be chronically absent from school. And they really may be lacking the resources and opportunities to make up for lost time in the classroom. What do we know? The data shows us in high minority districts, chronic absenteeism grew 15 points from 17% in 2018 to 32% in 2022. Meanwhile, in low minority, so majority white districts, the increase was 10 points. So that's still really concerning. And chronic absenteeism has been a long-standing challenge in our inner city schools. When schools went to remote learning, many students, including those without reliable internet access, they just disappeared. Some students had fallen so far behind they didn't come back, and others came back, but on a really inconsistent basis. And a lot of the reasons that we know our students are suffering from chronic absenteeism include what Hedy pointed out: lack of transportation, taking care of younger siblings, helping a grandparent, chronic health problems. That is a really big deal. Parents who don't speak English and they need their children to be with them to help them out with appointments or need their child to translate. So, what we've learned, there are really 5 realities that can make a difference. One is we want to make sure that this is not a hidden subject. We think that chronic absence is often hidden. A lot of people are not talking about it. This is the reason we're coming to you all today. We need more folks to be talking about this issue and talking about it deliberatively and with intention. It really is a reflection of how students feel. Do they feel a sense of belonging? Do they feel that they are engaged in school? Do they feel that their community is supporting them? So really a reflection of school and community environment. Punitive responses, we're going to talk a little bit about those later, not effective. Kids don't want to be told that they're being bad. They don't want to be told that there's something at the end of this that's going to punish them. And we do know that improving attendance requires prevention and early intervention and real authentic partnerships with students, families, and communities.
Thanks, Denise. I really appreciate you adding to how we understand the challenge and both the short-term and long-term impacts on students and the disproportionate impact, as you were saying, around students of color in particular, and then some of those realities around elevating the issue, making sure that we're talking about the culture that's within a community, a culture that's within a school, that makes it a welcoming place, makes it an engaged place for students to want to come. Want to stick with you, and then we'll go to Hedy. In terms of the strategies that you're elevating right now, for a number of your states and communities that you're working in, what are you seeing as some of the places that are making progress? What are they doing to sort of move that work forward?
Well, at EdTrust, we love data. So we really want folks to be thinking about how you can make better use of data to make evidence-based decisions to lower chronic absenteeism. We think that data needs to be disaggregated in a real way by student demographics. That means race, ethnicity, gender, disability status, English language learners. It's a, only recently has it really become a widely used education metric, but it's easily masked. And we think that we need to be pulling out this data in a much more intentional way. Chronic absence really reveals how many and which students have missed too much school for any reason, while truancy only counts unexcused absences. And we want to make sure that we understand the difference because that's really important. And using chronic absence data and other metrics to allocate, we want to make sure that we're using that data to allocate the right resources to improve school and community conditions. That is the way that we know that we'll get the supports in the schools that need it the most and where we've really seen the educational disparities come to the rise to the top. So, we really do think that when you're thinking about resources, targeting them to the schools that need it the most, targeting it to the communities. We cannot forget the communities who have been feeling this the most, and thinking mostly about how that data will inform what your responses are going to be is going to be really important.
Thanks so much, Denise. And you mentioned, really just starting with the data is really the way to have the conversation, and then mapping your interventions to support that work and where it's most needed. Hedy, I know you've mentioned in other contexts, and you'll likely raise it here around some of the data dashboards that are being used across the country, Rhode Island, Indiana, as just a few. Can you talk a little bit more about the data and sort of what you're seeing as similar question to you, or just around strategies that you're seeing some progress in helping to meet this challenge?
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna also just use slides a little bit to help in this, in that I think it'll offer a visual that captures some of what Denise was saying, but maybe offers a little bit of a bigger frame on that. Those data dashboards are part of what we mean by actionable data. And most districts, by the way, have the data, and many are creating actionable data dashboards that disaggregate. Not all of it is public. The public data tends to be on state websites, and that tends to be a little more delayed. Although, as you mentioned, there are a couple of states where they're making it more public. But everyone has this data to take action. The challenge we have is even when they have data dashboards, people don't actually know how to use it. How to take it and use it effectively. And this is where I would talk about positive engagement and further building on what Denise said. So all the research shows that punitive action, I'm going to fine you, I'm going to take away your driver's license, I'm going to, put you even spending time in juvenile hall. Those actually haven't been proven to improve attendance, because while you improve attendance is understanding why kids are missing school in the first place, and then coming up with solutions that actually address those issues. And if you start with punitive action, often you may be alienating families so much that they don't actually tell you what's really happening, so you can come around and resolve those underlying issues. So positive engagement, like in Connecticut, they have LEAP home visits. Those are shown to improve chronic absence, improve attendance by like 15 percentage points. That's because they're starting with the positive engagement. Parent-teacher home visiting, where you have teachers forging relationships with kids in the beginning of the year and creating it. Those have been proven to make sure that attendance improves. Offering positive communications like nudge letters that aren't blaming, but that help families know how many days their kids missed, help families know what they were missing when they missed school, help families connect to resources. Those improve attendance. Strategic partnerships. This is why some states have really invested in community schools. And then there's the adequate, equitable resources and shared accountability so that we all see that this is not about blame, but all of us taking responsibility to move this. And this is ultimately, to me, about taking a tiered approach. And what I would also say is that before the pandemic, I think the numbers weren't so huge. And a lot of people thought, oh, I can just assign a social worker and they'll be able to address the issue. The numbers are way too big. They need a whole school approach that starts with this investment in what we call positive conditions for learning, making sure kids feel safe, making sure kids feel a sense of belonging, connection, academic engagement. And then you use your data to figure out what additional kinds of layers of support. And what we've been seeing, and this is work that I've been doing with Bob Balfans, is particularly key strategies right now are family engagement. Families haven't been in schools, they don't necessarily know what their kids are learning, especially with their youngest learners. Student connectedness, kids feeling that there's an adult in the school who cares, peers who they can connect to, are engaged in something pro-social, feel that school is a place that is affirming and welcoming of who they are. That's really key. Health and safety. Boy, we were just, NPR did a story yesterday on one of the bright spot districts that we had found in California, Livingston, and they really focused on the role of the school nurse because families have so many different questions and concerns. And when you have a school nurse who can both make sure that they know when they should show to school and when they should not show up to school, when they have a symptom of illness, or making sure that if their kid who has asthma is showing up to school, that the school knows what to do if there's an asthma attack, those things are key. And how we have school nurses, how we have health providers, sometimes even taking advantage of virtual health, especially in rural communities where sometimes one of the reasons they miss a lot of schools because they're spending 3 hours trying to get to a regular doctor's appointment. Those are keys. And then community partnerships. And when we weave this together, using data and having school teams and district teams, we've really seen chronic absence turn around, and we've seen districts make measurable reductions in chronic absence.
Thanks, Hedy. And I really like what you're saying around not only collecting the data. Sounds like districts and states are doing a much better job of that, but being able to take action on it in a myriad amount of ways, particularly with family engagement at the center of that. You mentioned the LEAP program in Connecticut, and just for our viewers, we'll include not only the slides and websites that have been shared today, but any exemplars that are discussed in the webinar. We'll make sure to attach it to the recording.
So can I say one more thing?
Yeah,
that I
of course,
just would
please.
say? One of the challenges we see is that schools and districts and states are just way too departmentalized. Everything's isolated from each other. When addressing chronic absence really requires not, family engagement sits separate from attendance. We don't think about how to address it. Or expanded learning, which could be an incredible resource for making sure kids feel student connectedness. They're not part of the conversation. And so it's not only having data dashboards, it's helping make sure that everyone who should see the data can get to the data. Do your after school staff see the data and know how to reach out, which kids they could be reaching out to provide support and make sure they feel that connection? Do school nurses sometimes aren't even part of the attendance team? So while they could be the best source of outreach to families, they're not being called upon, and they're not being told, here are the kids who, if you would call and make sure they're okay, that might be a way. So one thing that I really encourage states, that fragmentation happens at every level, and states could be setting a precedent as well as offering guidance so that everyone in every division knows that this is going to take all hands on deck. We all have to see this data, And we all have to work together to take action and make sure that families feel that they're being treated as wholes.
I'm so glad you elevated that, Hedy. We're seeing a lot more interest and momentum around cross-agency collaboration, particularly across health, human services, and education. One of the governor's offices we're working with right now, Oregon, Governor Kotek's office, has health and education as partners in working around chronic absenteeism and having some shared metrics of accountability for how they're moving that work forward. Agree there. I want to turn back over to Dr. Malkus. Just give you a chance. One, if you wanted to weigh in on anything that has been said over the last from Hedy and Denise. And then I know you released a paper earlier this year, Long COVID for Public Schools, and it not only talked about some of the drivers of the rates, but also some actions at the end that you thought may show some promise. So if you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll go into that paper just because I think it does back what Hedy and Denise were saying. Look, the real question that I had with this paper on long COVID was, what is the most recent data telling us about the sort of post-COVID world? My thought was that the high rates we saw in 2022, that's the year of Omicron, were going to come down much more rapidly. That was my hope. And we haven't seen that. And that is what makes this such an important thing for states to prioritize, to keep the attention on this up until we turn it around. Because I think what we're all afraid of is that the post-pandemic sort of habits become the new normal, and that elevated chronic absenteeism is a thing that we live with. That is terrible. It's terrible for a number of reasons, but especially at the state level. I think governors should be concerned because number one, if they don't act soon, then they might not be able to counter sort of those new norms about it's just, it's not as big of a deal. So I think it's important to make a big deal now. And I think the other reason that governors should really animate that is really, if you think about this, whether your schools are funded on an average daily attendance basis or on a membership basis, this sort of functions like a tax, right? I mean, high chronic absenteeism means students are learning less, even though we're putting mostly the same resources in. This is most states' biggest spend. So there's just a basic sort of, public good, but also sort of tax and benefit calculation that really, I think, pushes on this. I do think that, back to the question about the paper, I'm really convinced that everything that Hedy and Denise mentioned about sort of the specific antecedents or the specific causes of chronic absenteeism, absolutely true. But I also think that during the pandemic, we had a lot of messages that sort of changed our habits and routines, and we have a lot of work to do to kind of crank that back. That's not easy. In fact, I'm more convinced of this now. I'm trying to get more data where it's available in states on what are we looking at? What's underneath this? Is it more truancy? Is it more excused absences? Maybe it's more sickness. And what I see time and time again, state after state where we have this data, is it's all of the above. It's not a one thing that's driving this. And so I'm really convinced that strong leadership from states is sort of the necessary, not sufficient, but necessary thing that can elevate this for this coming school year as the #1 priority, both for the sort of fiscal concerns, also for providing cover for superintendents and principals down the line to really get in and push hard on this, because we've heard this many times, but it is definitely true. This is an all hands on deck required effort. And if we have less than that, I think that the real threat is long term, we kind of get used to this, and it's something that we can't afford.
Thanks, Dr. Malkus. Really talking about not falling into a new norm. I think that's important messaging there, and really using the bully pulpit that governors have. We were just in Rhode Island, and Governor McKee had a pep rally really to celebrate for those districts across and schools that have made progress as a way to cap the the end of the year and bringing parents and families and students from across the state, and then coming back early next school year and continuing to make progress. So appreciate you calling that out. And you also mentioned about the messaging, and how that's shifted over time. And I want to go to Denise and then Hedy just around what you've seen as some of the messaging and communication that has resonated with parents and families, particularly as we're coming out of the pandemic here.
Yeah, one of the, as Hedy mentioned earlier, punitive actions are not really delivering on improving attendance. What we do think matters more is making sure that schools and their partners, and I think schools should be relying on their partners even more, community partners in particular, to develop strong relationships with students. I mean, a lot of your after school programs um, have deep relationships with these students, sometimes even more so than the schools do. And so we should be really relying on them to help reinforce some of the messaging, and engaging them in developing solutions to some of these attendance related issues that are really affecting our young students' lives. The fact that they aren't in school means we know that their academic performance, their engagement, risks that are associated with not being in school is really heightened. And we don't need to be putting more of our children at risk at this time after they've been going through so much. Really thinking about how we draw upon the knowledge of students and their families. They are closest to this. So, what can we be doing to really think about creating with them effective solutions? A lot of this relies on family and community engagement and making sure that they know what attendance is about, they know what attendance leads to, and that they can see what the outcomes of that are. Healthier families, healthier communities, students being more successful as they graduate and enter into college and career. Um, and then I think, I just can't say enough about co-creating some of these solutions with families and communities that really will make a difference, when we work with the families and communities that are closest to this, who have been most impacted to this. We know that we can really create solutions that are going to matter and result in better outcomes.
Hedy, you want to add on to? Thanks.
Yeah. So first of all, on your question of messaging, we have this toolkit that we created, and we found that it resonates. Show Up matters for real, and that's because when you show up to school every day, it helps you build those routines that are so important to your social emotional well-being. Kids, we're all out of routine, and kids got to be in routine to develop. And it deals with some of the anxiety that kids have had. The second thing is about engagement. When you're in school, that's where you connect to other peers, you connect to adults. It's about access to resources. That's enrichment, that's sports, that's access to healthcare, mental health care. School is a place where kids can get that. And then it's also about learning. And I think issues around learning, one of the things is, while I do think it's important to talk about long-term outcomes, we have to do more messaging. And this is both at the bully pulpit of the state level, but states helping localities. Kids have to know from their teachers, from their schools, what are they learning every single day, and why, if they miss the next day or they miss that morning period, this is what you're not getting, and this is how you're falling behind. So, you know, even making sure that chronic absence and attendance and what you missed when you weren't there is part of your parent-teacher conferences with families and with youth people, young people, sorry. Making sure that, I think kids have to hear the immediate. When you're not here, you miss out on this. When they miss school and then they come back the next day, they hear they were missed, but they also hear, and you missed out on this, and their families know that. There's something that happened in the pandemic where I think we got less and less clear about the value of school every single day for kids' learning development. And at every single level, we have to emphasize that being in school every day, learning is scaffolded. And when you aren't there in school, you miss out on a concept that then makes it harder for you to learn the next concept. So one I would say is that we have to get better at our messaging. We have to be more immediate in our messaging. But then the other thing I would say is, my worry is that some people have already lost hope. Oh, we just throw my hands up. I can't change this. And one of the things that governors can do is we have to highlight the places, because you can find them in every single part of this country, that actually have been making significant reductions in chronic absence. I will guarantee you that almost every one of them are taking a prevention-oriented approach that then allows them to engage families and kids. But communities and educators need to hear those concrete examples. They need to hear how, for example, in Richmond, Virginia, as they've done these home visits out, when they've found out these particular challenges around housing and then partnered with the housing agency to create more stable housing, families came back to school. Or they need to hear how, I think this is in Avondale, you know, one of the strategies that the superintendent used when the COVID finally was letting up was reestablishing middle school sports teams. Because it turns out that when you get kids engaged in sport teams, they want to show up to school for their peers and for those activities. We need these concrete examples that show this isn't rocket science. This is, you know, this is within your reach. And give those examples so people feel they'll know it's possible to change, and they have ideas that they can then take and apply in their own communities. And then the last thing I would go back to is the data piece. And this is something that, for example, Virginia did. Virginia took all of its data and realized, as they were going to go into school improvement, and we can leverage existing systems, they realized which schools were going to be in trouble because of chronic absence. And before they even released that data, they said to these schools, hey, have you looked at your data? Do you know what's going to happen? And then they provided technical assistance and support, so they understood what were effective strategies for improving attendance. And then they released the data, and then they encouraged them to figure out, how do you take action as you're planning for a better school year the next year? That's strategic use of data.
Thank you both. That's really, really helpful. Thinking about that we're talking about the school connectedness, the authentic engagement and partnership of parents and families and students in not only looking at the data, but taking action and elevating concrete examples of what's happening and being able to learn from that to take those actions. And Hedy, you also mentioned hope, and I think we always try to end these webinars with on an optimistic note. Love to just go around to each of you. We're looking at a lot of hard data today, and hopefully making progress in some parts of the country. As you said, good work happening. Dr. Malkus, let's start with you and just say, you know, where are you seeing some hope right now? What gets you more positive looking at where we can go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm waiting for this next year of data and hoping that I see much better returns than we did. And look, I am really pleased to see some of the early, these are preliminary numbers from Massachusetts showing returns on those efforts. If you look at Rhode Island's tracking, they can also show that what looks to be like really deliberate progress. And I think that is showing that intensive effort with data back, right? Data supporting can draw attention, keep attention, and they're making good progress. I think at the same time, I don't want to sugarcoat it too much. They still have a long way to go. They're not back to pre-pandemic rates. They haven't, it's not a simple thing to fix. So I do think we're going to see progress, and I welcome it. I want to accelerate it, but I also want everyone to be in for the long haul, because the early returns on turning back a 90% increase probably going to be easy, and they're great, full stop. But it's a marathon, and one we need to sprint on. So yeah, but we are seeing good signs, and I think deliberative action from the state down to the local, down to the teacher and student level is the kind of thing that is going to move this forward.
Thanks, Hedy.
I want to echo Nat's comment that we need to take data-driven action to run this marathon. This is going to take persistence. I think we should be looking at setting goals over time and using our data to identify those places that are making a difference so we can spread and scale their work. I will say, Seth, that being at the White House in the middle of May gave me a lot of hope. Particularly facilitating that panel. And maybe this is something that you can make available to people, the recording where we had Richmond, Virginia, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Johnstown, New York, and Columbus, all talking about what they were putting in place. And at the minimum, they were getting at least about a quarter reduction. Not, as Nat said, they weren't all the way down, although Richmond, Virginia is pretty close to getting more with a pretty systemic effort. So that gives me hope. And the one last thing I do a call out is there's a couple of NPR recent radio shows that Corey Turner, he was able to go to Livingston, California, which was a little school district that I helped to introduce him to, because when we looked at the data across California, 1,000 districts, we found 20 districts of which there was better kindergarten attendance before and after the pandemic. And we had a chance to go out and find out what was going on. And what I will say is the thing that drove that so much was how they built relationship building into everything they did, including particularly the front line of what teachers do, supported by their administrators. So relationship building was a key piece of what they did. And they understood, and the first story talks really eloquently about, one of the things that has happened in schools is, even as a pandemic hit, we also had huge concerns about school safety happening at the same time. And so these schools are actually surrounded by a huge gate, where parents can only get in with permission. And the school then understanding that, took efforts to then make sure you have greeters outside the gate talking to this. And he shows the principal, Maite Ramirez, going out and bringing this kid who was reluctant to show up to school and walking him into school. And then he also shows how in some of the classes, they got peers, like little first graders, kindergartners, helping with their peers to get them to school. It's that relationship building that, when you hear them, makes so much of a difference. And then later on in the second story that they ran, they talk a lot about the relationship that the school nurse was able to form. So relationships matter. And what I think governors and states can do is help create visions of what that looks like and support schools and districts in making sure that they're prioritizing that relationship building, which is so essential to re-engaging our kids and families.
Thanks, Hedy. Denise?
I just want to double click on everything Hedy and Nat said. Governors can have a real role in this work. The bully pulpit is amazing when it comes to putting out a message about why attendance matters, why having strong relationships in schools matter, why engagement in school matters, and they can also be really instrumental in demonstrating and modeling what community engagement looks like, which we think is really important. And, the last thing I'll say is that our students still have substantial mental health needs, and schools really need to be supporting their social, emotional, and academic development over the coming years while the pandemic is still here, and many of our students are still feeling that. There's a new COVID variants. Many of our students are still feeling that. And it's just so important to recognize that we need to be supporting our students in every way possible. And I think another really interesting role that governors and state chiefs can have is investing in models that are closest to students. There's been some really neat work done by the Wallace Foundation and how principals can have a real role in making sure that students feel safe and that schools are safe and nurturing places. The research shows that principals should be ensuring that all schools are really a place where students feel welcomed. Hedy talked about this. Support teachers to be providing culturally responsive classrooms and engagement. Again, this community engagement. So this is something that can be done. Governors have an important role. Can be a statewide effort. And we think that with state leaders involved in this effort, we can see a real turnaround for our students, and that's what we all want.
Thanks, Denise, and thank you all, Hedy, Denise, Dr. Malkus. Great conversation, and really appreciate your leadership on these and so many other issues. And viewers, again, please note that all the reports, the resources discussed during the webinar, any PowerPoint slides, Hedy mentioned some of the examples that were shared at the White House. We'll include all of that attached to the recording once it's posted to the NGA website. So thanks again to all of our panelists, and until next time, thanks for tuning in and have a great day.